follow good practice based on my training and the vast amount of good practice literature available online. The purpose of this presentation is to share what I did this year in the garden and what I've learned and what I plan to improve next year. So kind of looking back, sharing that, and looking ahead. Okay, my approach, oops, it's jumping on me a bit. I'm sorry, I'm not fully literate on the presentation. I'm using, by the way, a Google Docs presentation format, which worked quite well. I know how to use PowerPoint, but I've become more comfortable with the Google Docs. So my approach, I start everything from seed. I don't buy any vegetable plants now. That's something I've been able to do for a couple of years successfully. I did buy a couple herb plants because I couldn't get the seeds because they were sold out or no longer available. I bought a mint plant and a chai plant for salads and, you know, to have on hand. And I've also been drying herbs. Under lights, I grow tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, and basil, and a few flowers. I mix my own seed starter. You can, as everybody knows, you can buy good mixes, but you can also easily buy ingredients. And there's, as with many things, many different mixes that you see people recommending. But the basic being soilless and then transitioning to, you know, another mix that's got fertilizer or nutrition in it. On the seed starting, I do this in the basement. I've fortunately got space. I've got a banquet table. And I did a do-it-yourself on some of the lighting. So I don't have a fancy stand. I might build one this next year to improve the space I have, but I use PVC pipe and bought shop lights. I do have one purchased light, and I haven't really been too concerned about the different types of lighting. That doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. So you can relatively inexpensively, you know, get set up to grow under lights. Some things I've done, you know, buying more stuff is heating mats, which seem to have helped with peppers. I bought some nice plastic trays that are strong enough to assist with the movement of the seedlings, moving things around, which is a big help. I also sow seeds outside, direct sow, and this is just based on, you know, good practice and the directions on the seed pack. I use raised beds primarily. I have some containers I'm trying, and I've got one bed that's kind of ground level that I did this year to use for zucchini because of the sprawl. A major focus area, of course, for all of us as master gardeners and gardening in general is building healthy soil. So through training, reading, trial and error, I've been trying to improve the quality of the soil out there. I try mixed planting. In other words, one box isn't one plant. Mindful of plants that complement each other. And I also mix in basil or marigolds in beds to discourage some pests. This year planted onions around the edge of beds, and that worked okay. It got a little bit crowded for the onions. And I'm mindful also of rotation, although with raised beds, if you don't have a huge garden with a lot of space, I think rotation is a good thing to do, but things are close and they're mixed already, which is, there's some benefit. So rotation to discourage pets from moving in is a good thing to do, but I don't think it's 100% possible depending on the space you've got. I irrigate from hoses. I don't have a fancy irrigation system. I put UGG there because of the schlepping of hoses, particularly in July this year. That was a major effort. And on that, the container gardening, again, as master gardeners, home gardeners would know, are a bigger challenge in hot weather. You really got to stay on top of the irrigation because the soil dries out very quickly. I make minimum use of pesticides. I'll talk more about that later. And moderate use of organic fertilizer. I try to apply good sanitation, keeping the beds clean before, during, and after, and doing some pruning, to assist with soil circulation. I think that helps based on my results this year. I mentioned my interest in native planting, and I also compost. I put some compost because I avoid putting certain things in the compost bin, like tomatoes that might have some, plants that have disease, or weeds that have gone to seed. What did I grow? Typical things, I think, but increasing variety of things where I see that it works. Garlic, chard, kale, lettuce, spinach, arugula, carrots, dill, cilantro, parsley, and onions. And as with all cool season crops, the summer here is brutal. So things like the lettuce, spinach, arugula, dill, cilantro, less so parsley, I found, don't like the heat that well. And they, or the growth accelerates, like arugula goes to seed pretty quickly. Warm season, I mentioned the standard crops. And this year I introduced for the first time butternut squash, which is doing quite well, corn, which did pretty well. What else? And onions, which was fun. I used onion sets.
Mark,
yes.
There's a question in the chat box for you about what kind of organic fertilizer you use and why do you choose to limit the amount that you use? Will you address that later, or do you want to speak to that now?
Yeah, a little bit. I can address it now. I use fish fertilizer and compost. I'm not sure if the compost is, I use McGill's, light, and leaf grow. Leaf grow, I think, is organic. I don't know if those are OMRI certified, and some Espoma products. And the issue about limiting is from soil tests, and I'll talk about that later. I tend to be cautious with fertilizer because of unintended consequences of over-fertilizing, and I'm trying to strike a balance. Did that answer the question? I think it did.
Yes.
And as with all marketing, advertising and labels and stuff, it's not always clear to me what organic means, but I look for OMRI certified. And Espoma is, a good name, but they manufacture their stuff, and I'm not sure if they've got OMRI certifications on everything. But I'll talk a little bit more about this. Here's some pictures, not doing a tour. This is from April. Things look a little bit of a mess. I'm working on a path this is from a deck off the back of the house, looking over the backyard. And as you can see, raised beds are my preferred method. with to the, I don't know if you can see a pointer, I've got a bed here that I use for zucchini. So you can see my compost bins. I moved one to put it in a better spot. So that's to give an overview of my layout. The direction this photo was taken in is south, so I get pretty good sun, 6 to 8 hours, although I've got some issues with things growing and shading one side of the garden. Up here, you can, on the upper right of the slide, you can see a photo of plants in progress. So just some more pictures of, my approach in the containers, rather than talking a lot about what's planted here. Here, I on the left, I included the picture to show the trellis from PVC. I haven't yet hung the netting on that, but that was used for cucumbers. I grew Persian cucumbers, which do quite well from seed. And on the right, this is container gardening, and I got these rail planters from Gardener Supply. They work great with lettuce in the spring, and then you can just go out the door and pick leaf lettuce. Yeah. And in the background, you can see I think I probably took this because of the goldfinch at the feeder.
Mark, on that raised bed on the left, do you use mulch in the raised bed box?
Yeah, I did. This picture is actually from last year, and I did. I should have used it this year. So it's a good to do. I think it's a good practice. But part of it was, and my excuse was getting the material, schlepping stuff, particularly with the pandemic situation.
And is that wood bark mulch or is it leaf mulch? What is it?
This, I think, was, I don't know if it was Virginia, not the name of brand, from a nursery, Virginia Fines from Merrifield. I don't have a preferred mulch, but one consideration with the mulch, I mean, you could use leaf mulch, but that might have some undesirable seeds in it. But there's a little bit of caution needed with mulch, probably because of seeds that you don't want to get in the garden. So that's a good question, and that's something I'm going to consider for planning next year, is some cost-effective mulch that's going to protect moisture and reduce weeds. I have a crazy problem with maple seedlings. I mean, the maple trees are dropping their seeds like machines. So I may cover the beds with cloth to prevent the seeds from taking hold. That was the biggest hassle with the weed control. Here's a couple sort of, again, the theme being my approach to companion planting, if that's the right term here. I've got on the left bush beans with corn. It's said in the literature, stated that this is a desirable combination. One thing I'll try next year, and I'm still thinking about the corn, is putting in some pole beans to grow up the corn stalks just for fun. Because pole beans I accidentally planted some. I didn't read the seed packet cover properly, and they are very aggressive and need good support to keep them separated from things. On the right, there's a area under the deck with a lattice. You're kind of using what I've got as far as existing structures for gardening support, where I hung the garlic bulbs that were harvested. It was a great place to dry because it's dry, shaded, and there's some airflow. So that was kind of, I'll try to hang these over here for a couple weeks to get them to dry before I clean them up and put them in the house for storage. So what worked well this year, patting myself on the back, planning of the bed layouts, looking at the records I kept from last year on when I put things out, when I started to seed, when I transplanted the seedlings to larger pots, when I planted out. On the bed layout, I've actually drawn, layouts, and I'm trying to concentrate on the spacing because I've had problems with overcrowding. Again, a typical gardener problem is to not remember or take note of how big the plants get. And things like tomatoes, as many of us know who grow tomatoes, they sprawl and go all over the place, even with pruning.
Mark, did you use any particular planning method or software or tool?
No, I think I looked around very briefly and figured I've got some graph paper and a graph paper rule and a pencil. So I just scaled the drawing on the paper and used paper and pencil and to erase and play around with things. So I was trying to to stop myself from over planning, which was a little bit of a problem this year still. So no, I haven't looked at software. I may see what's available, but I was fine with a binder with paper. Seed starting, I think I've kind of mentioned this. The tendency is, if the seeds sprout, you want to treat the seedlings like babies almost. And in prior years, I said, man, you find yourself just moving around, dealing with the space and keeping your seedlings alive, and then realizing, well, I don't have enough space to accommodate all these seedlings, even giving away. So I did a better job on resisting the temptation to grow too much, keep it all alive, and keep nurturing it. And I was also happy to share with neighbors. And I mentioned that having these large plastic trays, again, not to advertise for anybody, that I got at Gardener Supply, that really helped me in moving, and they were appropriate to put the seed pots in. And I don't use peat pots, I use plastic pots that I either recycle or purchased, and make sure I clean everything before reusing.
Mark, we have another question in the chat box regarding this slide. One person is wondering, which is the chicken and which is the egg? Do you order the seeds and then figure out what's in the plan, or do you make a plan and then go buy the seeds?
Well, this year, good question. This year I had, fortunately, most of the seeds, because some of us encountered seeds selling out. So I had my seeds, and I've tended to, if something works well, I use it again, or if a particular seed supplier works well. And on the mail order seed, or if you're just shopping at a garden center, I look at the size. I've got some things listed, but there's some seed suppliers that have a lot of containers or raised bed type seeds, like Renee's Gardens is good for container plants, which are very good for raised beds. So it's kind of a combination of reading while you're purchasing and using a lot of seeds that I've used before that work well.
And then also one other question, Mark, you were mentioning the planting of the garlic and your success in harvesting it, and you showed us how you dry it. When is the best time to plant garlic?
I've planted it in October. And then this year it was early because of the warm winter, I think. Mm-hmm. And the garlic bulbs, the tip for everybody, some of you know this already, is the garlic bulbs are becoming available now, and you can pre-order. And because of the anxiety caused by the pandemic and stuff selling out, I jumped on ordering my bulbs. But I've planted them in October, and then they're available. This year is a little bit earlier in late June. So it's late June, early July is when they start to be ready to bring in. So that was, garlic is easy and satisfying. There is the handling and processing, but the other thing with garlic bulbs, real quick, I'm burning up my time, is you get a couple garlic bulbs and break it down into the seed cloves, and you got a lot of garlic. So that's just something to be mindful of. You don't need a lot of bulbs to get a lot of garlic, because you break them down. And then again, you don't want to waste them, and you end up filling a lot of beds. Just moving on, some pest control, I'll mention that again later, Nora, but I put the word some, I qualified it there because I've been very hesitant to apply pesticides historically, but because of a disaster with eggplant last year with the hated flea beetle, I used spinosad, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, when I saw the flea beetles appear. I also used some covers. I put the eggplants out after they got a little bit bigger, and that was a tip from one of the classes, not an uncommon thing, so that the plants can handle the flea beetle better. I need to do more on pest control, and I'll mention that more later. I mentioned culture controls and sanitation. I think this helped for sure, keeping things clean and air circulation. I did some pruning on the lower branches of tomatoes. Succession and fall planning, I think I'm doing a better job with, when the cool season things die out, getting the warm season crops in. Thinking about fall planting early so that I'm ready with space and seeds. Canning, freezing, and storing, learning more about that, and the canning's pretty labor intensive, and you gotta be cautious with it, but got a lot of satisfaction out of doing that, and we did more this year because we got experience last year. So I've canned tomatoes and made sauce and canned it, and beans, and plan to do some pickled canning with peppers. Some things are better for freezing, like kale and chard. Sharing and donating. I was quick to take things when I had too many zucchini or too many cucumbers in particular to a food bank, and that they were set up where you could safely drop things off. And sharing with neighbors is always fun. And also, I think I mentioned shared plants.
Mark, there's a question in the chat box about your relationship with deer. In one of the early photos, I saw that you had a fence on at least part of your garden. Do you have to exclude deer actively?
This year hasn't been a big problem in the past. I don't have any structures to repel deer or discourage deer. There are deer, so I didn't have a problem this year. That's a knock on wood. You know how that goes. You say that, and then a couple of days later, the deer eat your hydrangea or whatnot. Bigger problem with other animals, and I'll mention that later. So no, deer haven't been a big problem for me, so I haven't done much, and hopefully the deer don't hear that and come over tonight. Here's a planning tool I made. This is just a spreadsheet. This is an Excel actually imported to the share drive. So here I'm keeping track of what I'm doing, where I got it, what the seed was packed for, etc. And this is helping me a lot. So that's a planning tool. Use a buzz term tool, but And then disciplining myself to go back and keep updating it.
Mm-hmm.
So highlights from this year: the lettuce. We had a cool spring. The kale, the chard, the spinach wasn't as great as I'd like, but I had super results with lettuce. So it's very satisfying to have that well into June, surprisingly. And you learn about lettuce that can handle some hot weather. The July was too much for all varieties or most, and the chard actually can handle heat pretty well. Kale maybe a little less so, helped by or hurt by the cabbage moss. So that was great. In containers works better for me. Definitely with the lettuce. The kale and the chard do great in the beds. The eggplants, I mentioned use of spinosad. Really happy with the eggplants this year. I grow Black Beauty and Asian size. We talked about the garlic. The garlic was really good. Peppers are started a bit earlier this year. I had to do some pruning to take off early flowers and some early fruit from the lower branches. I don't know if that was fertilizer or what, but the peppers are going strong now. Poblano has been wonderful for several years. This year, the California Wonder, which is a basic green pepper, are doing really well. I haven't had such good results before with those. And a macaroni pepper, which is a sweet pepper. Those are a little slower to turn to pretty colors, but they're good when they're green too. And then some snack peppers. Tomatoes, the Roma tomatoes, which are great, of course, for canning and sauce. I had some disease issues with the Roma, and that was in part because of overcrowded planting. I grow a variety called Brandywine, which is a wonderful eating tomato, and cherry tomato, the Sun Gold, which everybody loves, but is a sprawling plant, and a bush variety that's done really well, again with some crowding and disease issues there. I discovered zucchini blossoms. I had better results with zucchini, and we did some fried zucchini blossoms, which was really delicious, fun to harvest and understand, the structure of the flowers and the male versus the female there, and got to be careful to make sure you get the bugs out before you cook them, although bugs aren't necessarily poisonous. So that was fun to discover that, you've heard about it and then you do it yourself, and it's very delicious. And I think I mentioned I grew a few things for the first time: corn, butternut squash, and onions, and did pretty well. The butternut squash I haven't harvested. It takes a long time to mature. And as we know, squash plants, this was a smaller variety, but they're huge. Oops.
Mark, the question about your success with the peppers, did you raise those in beds or containers?
The only things I did under lights were peppers, zucchini, and eggplant, and the basil and some flowers. So the pepper plants were from seed. And I mentioned heat mats are helpful.
But did you put them out in beds or containers?
Oh, I'm sorry, both. Go on, I'm sorry.
Was one better than the other?
Beds are better. Containers are working better for me this year. The drainage in the containers and the drying out and watering causes stress. So I'm kind of nodding my head and furrowing my brows. I'm getting some good results from the containers, but I'm happier with the raised beds. And the things I put in the containers were appropriate for the containers too. So it can work. You got to watch the irrigation, too much or too little. Because as experienced gardeners know, or many gardeners know, if your soil mix kind of dries out, the peat or core, whichever you use for that aspect of the soil mix, it doesn't re-moisten sometimes. You can be surprised when you pull stuff out of a pot and it's dry after being watered. So suffice it to say the containers can work, but keeping them properly watered can be a challenge. These are just some illustrations of results. Onions are labor intensive, and there's some amusing, there's as always out there, YouTube videos, but they require careful, timely harvest and careful drying out, emphasis on drying out so that you don't have moisture in the stem that ends up rotting the onion, or bacteria. You know how onions are in a basket. If one goes bad, you got a real mess on your hands. So on the left, I've got the onions out drying. I had them out for a couple weeks outside. Animals, of course, don't bother them. And this upper right is the butternut squash, which is looking very good, but it takes up a lot of space. And the garlic, another thing is, getting it, trying to pull it when it's kind of dry, carefully pull it so you don't rip it apart, because they are dirty. Just some pictures of the chard. You can get a feel for the size of the chard. Is a beautiful plant. You can just enjoy it for its colors, relative to the bananas, although part of that's just a distortion from the image, besides the image. The poblano, a great pepper to grow and cook with, and they hold up pretty well. There's some macaroni mixed in here. And I mentioned the eggplant. This is an Asian variety. The eggplant is a beautiful plant with very pretty flowers. There's still a flea beetle issue. I mentioned spinosad and some cultural type stuff, removing lower leaves. The flea beetles are still working on these, but they're strong enough and mature enough that it fends it off. And the thing with the controls on these vegetables is to, get it on before the flowers start so that you don't harm beneficial insects, and get the pesticide, in this case, the spinosad, on the plant, not on the soil. Looking ahead, soil, I should have put an exclamation mark next to that. I learned from a soil test, we preach soil testing at our clinics and in our training. In soil testing, I discovered that I had very high levels of P and K, potassium and phosphorus, that I didn't need to add that. Not that it would be that harmful, but that was a surprise. My pH levels were a bit high. So that was something, it was okay for the vegetables, but I was a bit surprised. So I retested and did more tests, more samples. Sampling is important with the soil tests. And I actually bought a pH kit that worked well with capsules that you dump powder into a sample and add water and shake it and get a color spectrum. So soil testing, be aware, know what's in your soil, what you've got. I can't emphasize more so that you don't overdo it, because that's a tendency. You think adding a good thing like compost, well, you can give it too much, just like you can give something too much fertilizer, too much water.
Did you do anything to try to adjust your pH?
I found that I was up in the 7.75, and for the plants I didn't, but I'm going to keep an eye on it. So I didn't take action, but I tried to avoid things that might, make that worse. So that was a surprise. The soil test was a surprise, caused me to retest. I also used nitrogen only fertilizer I mentioned fish fertilizer maybe that I used, which is pretty low N, low nitrogen, sort of moderate. And I didn't use the espoma this year. So I reduced fertilizer, and at the beginning I mixed in some blood meal. I was cautious with the nitrogen. As we know, that can burn things or cause them to grow too fast. So I need to learn more and work on the soil health through my training and my own research. So no, I didn't do anything specific for the pH. I think the test, it might have had to do with the samples in part, interestingly, but that's something I'm going to relook at in samples this fall. I added thin layers of compost, again, naming a brand, McGill's, which seems to be quite good. And I didn't use leaf grow this year, although I did add some composted leaves, again, moderate amounts. Bed layouts I mentioned, continue to try to get a good mix with enough space. Another thing is the supports. I think I'll probably mention that again, or try to go more, I put organic here, learn more about what organic gardening, what that means, try to be healthy and balanced in what I do in the garden, and organic is part of that. Natives, I might have mentioned earlier, maybe I forgot to read that bullet. I've planted natives in the surrounding area to encourage pollinators and removed invasives. Sometimes I'm surprised at what has become invasive. So I'm not militant about that, but I'm trying to understand how that can help, and help both, the environment, but also help the garden maybe in attracting desirable insects and, predators for undesirable impact. 4-season harvest, I'm going to try to extend the season by building a cold frame to lay over one of the boxes. But the way things go here, there are some things like that overwinter, kale and chard, and of course the garlic. And I put some onion seeds in this year to see how they do. So I mentioned problems here. Maybe some of us have seen vine borers. Here's a healthy zucchini plant. This is a nice variety, a smaller plant. It's just got one big stem, but it still takes up a lot of space. There's a Black Beauty zucchini behind it. These are huge, these zucchini plants when they're healthy. The vine borer, I didn't do anything knowing that it was going to be a problem. And eventually they catch up, but in this case I had pretty healthy plants, and this is the disaster came, the collapse last week. So doing something about the vine borer next year, I'll do more research and try the different methods, because I think the idea of actually getting in and pulling them out would be something to try, or some covers. People have tried aluminum foil around the base of the stems, but I didn't do any pest control, and I got really good harvest on the zucchini, and a couple of the Black Beauty zucchini are still going pretty strong, although they do have vine borers. So another thing I did is I immediately or quickly removed these and put them in the trash. I didn't put them in the compost. And I've got to clean up those beds this year. Pest control, animal control. Here's a squirrel. Squirrel are entertaining creatures, but here's a squirrel munching on a tomato. So my biggest issues with animals were with, let me just go back to that, were with birds pecking the tomatoes. Squirrels, within the past 2 or 3 weeks have decided to pick the right tomatoes and carry them around and munch them. I had enough tomatoes. I planted too many tomatoes as I did last year, but so that's less of a problem. But I threw away a lot of tomatoes that had been damaged by birds, and the squirrels kind of scatter them around. They like to ruin them, and sometimes they eat them. So those, I think the animal issue was a bigger problem than insects, to be honest. So on the animals, just to finish, it's this question of, you maybe saw, I didn't use any fencing around any of the beds. That would help with, I should have also mentioned on the animals, dogs and cats can be a problem. You have a nice clean bed that you've put seed in, and a cat comes along and thinks it's a litter box. I mean, it's pretty disgusting, so I keep an eye out for that. And dogs, and maybe this is the case with the cats and the squirrels too, I'm not sure. I mean, some of the compost we use as a fertilizer, the fragrance of that or smell can attract critters. What I'm going to do this fall, I'm working on, what I'm doing now is planting cool season crops. I've mentioned my garlic bulbs I've ordered. In cool season, I've got kale seed, chard, arugula, carrots. I'm trying turnips for the first time and putting out lettuce in the containers. Clean up the beds thoroughly. Try again cover crops. I used some clover last year. I didn't do my research well enough. Clover's great, but clover has pretty aggressive roots. So what I did before it went to flowers, I turned it in the soil, but some of it comes back. So you got to be out there kind of picking it so it doesn't interfere with the plants. And I mentioned building a cold frame. Here's some resources. Tori, is this posted?
I'll put it on YouTube later.
Yeah. So VCE publications are great, particularly as you get more experience, you go back and look at these things that you knew about, and they're very valuable, a very good reference information. This planting guide with recommended planting dates and amounts to plant, that talks about relative to the average last frost date, average first freeze date, and then the economics of planting, where you're going to get a bigger bang for the buck. In this case, it's for home gardens too. So you don't want to put a big effort into planting and, you get some results, but based on the effort and cost of making it work, it's kind of not worth it versus a farmer's market or the grocery store. My seed sources, botanical interest, Renee's garden I mentioned. I put Johnny Selected Seeds. They tend to cater to larger growers, but their catalog is a great reference. Happy gardening.